Well, and since we're talking about Cuba, we thought we would create the swampy atmosphere of a tropical climate. Apparently the AC is out here in the library, so we'll just hopefully nobody will DFO in here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about World Heritage sites in Cuba. Who knows what a World Heritage site is? Anybody ever heard of this? Randall. Exactly. They're sites that are recognized by a unit of the United Nations system, UNESCO, right? For having outstanding value, either cultural or natural resource value. And we'll look at what that means in just a minute. Cuba, this little island nation just south of the United States, actually has 9 World Heritage sites, and you can see here on the map where they are. They're sort of distributed across the island. And to give you some sense of comparison, the island nation of Cuba is about half the size of the United Kingdom. It has a population that's just a little bit higher than the state of Georgia. That should give you something to compare it with in terms of size and population. But let's talk about this entity for a second that has actually created this thing known as the World Heritage List, and that is UNESCO. So how many of you have heard of UNESCO before? Most of you, I hope. So it's the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. It's created in 1946. Why might this have been created in 1946? What had just ended in 1945? World War II. So in this aftermath, we have the creation of the UN. We have the creation of these units within the UN that are really trying to encourage peace and prosperity, right? And one way that it was thought that we could do this was through international cooperation in education, the sciences, and culture. There are 193 member states. The United States recently withdrew from UNESCO over the recognition of a site in Palestine as being worthy of the World Heritage List. And UNESCO's programs focus on promoting education and preserving cultural and natural resources. So UNESCO was created in 1946, and then in the 1970s, something called the World Heritage Convention is developed. And this was a result of sort of an all-hands-on-deck moment when in Egypt was constructing the Aswan Dam. And as they were building the dam, there were a number of ancient temples that were threatened by the dam. And so there was actually a lot of international cooperation around the globe to save these temples at Abu Simbel. And so some smaller structures were given to some of these countries that helped. We have, for instance, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, we have a small Egyptian temple there. But what UNESCO realized at that time was that there needed to be some more systematic way of creating an inventory of these cultural and natural resources out there all around the world that could potentially be threatened. And the idea was to raise awareness of these resources so that it wasn't always an emergency situation. And the idea is to compile a list of these resources considered to have outstanding universal value. In addition to creating this World Heritage Convention that was going to be responsible for compiling this list, UNESCO also created a World Heritage Fund. The UNESCO members create or contribute money to that fund, with the idea being that the wealthier countries contribute money that can then be used by some of the poorer countries to help conserve and preserve their resources. So this World Heritage List, again, it's, the idea was to identify, protect, and preserve the cultural and natural heritage around the world that's considered to be of outstanding value to humanity. The way this works, UNESCO and the members of the World Heritage Convention did not just go out there and start doing an inventory. The member nations are responsible for nominating properties for inscription on this list, on the World Heritage List. And so it's supposed to be an apolitical process. There are a number of professional organizations, ICOMOS, the International Council on Museums and Monuments is involved in this, that are supposed to be doing a neutral review, an apolitical review. One of the criticisms of the World Heritage List in recent years is that it has become very politicized, but nevertheless, it's the system that we have. To equate it to something that we have here in the United States that you might be familiar with, we have here in the United States something called our National Historic Landmarks Program. And that is the list. There are about 3,000 sites on that list of sites that are considered to be of exceptional importance to the history of the United States. So the World Heritage List has an even higher bar. As you can see, there are 1,121 sites that are listed on the World Heritage List. They're in 167 countries. The majority of them are cultural sites. There are 213 natural sites, 39 mixed sites. Those are sites that have both a natural and a cultural component. And then 53 of these sites are actually considered to be in danger, either from natural causes. Climate change is a big factor in terms of creating danger for some of these sites, and they're man-made causes as well. So this is the map of the world with each dot representing a World Heritage site. The green ones are the natural sites. The yellow ones are the cultural sites. If you see a site that's both green and yellow, half and half, it's a mixed site. And the red sites are the ones that are in danger. So what do you notice about the distribution of these sites? Where are the most sites located? In Europe, right. Actually, China now has the most sites. China has 56. They just had a new one inscribed over the summer. But Italy is fast on their heels. They have 55. And Italy alone has 55 World Heritage sites. In fact, one of the great criticisms of the World Heritage Program is that it very much has a Western European bias. So in recent years, there have been efforts to try to diversify the listings and add more sites that are in places outside of Western Europe. The jury's still out on how successful that effort is. To give you, bring it home a little bit to something that may be familiar to you, you see here the World Heritage sites in the United States. You see it's split almost even with, between cultural and natural resources. We have things that you might expect. A lot of these sites are actually Native American sites. Things like Chaco Canyon, the Cahokia Mounds. But there are also things like Independence Hall in Philadelphia, which is architecturally not that important. Why might Independence Hall be important? It's where right, it's sort of this birthplace of the republic, right? And this idea of a constitutional republic that we have that's still ongoing today. Monticello and the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. What's that about? It's the architecture of Thomas Jefferson, but it's also the architecture and ideas of Thomas Jefferson, because his architecture is very much imbued with his ideas on freedom and liberty and whatnot, and the idea of a republic and what that represents and how that can be represented in architecture. Our most recent addition is this, what you see here at the bottom, that was just inscribed this summer, the 20th century architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. So this is a collection of his buildings that really from around the country, his home, Taliesin, Falling Water, the Guggenheim Museum in New York, so a pretty big collection of Frank Lloyd Wright sites. And then on the natural resource side, we have things you might expect, like the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone. And we have one that's in danger, the Everglades. Why do you think the Everglades is in danger? Encroachment, so development in the area, runoff from agriculture. It was hit very hard in recent years by hurricanes, and we have the impact of climate change as well. So this is actually, the Everglades has been on the endangered list since 2010. This is its second bout on the endangered list. It was previously listed in 2007 on the endangered list, and then it got off the endangered list, and now it's back on. And I should say that being listed on the World Heritage list does not impose any restrictions on the sovereignty of the nation or any restrictions on what that nation can do with this resource. But if you really screw it up, you can get delisted. But realistically, that's sort of meaningless too, because this is really just an honorary thing. The way the World Heritage List has begun to be thought about is that it's sort of a prize, and especially in developing countries, that it's a prize that if you get World Heritage Site recognition for a location in your country, tourists will come. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, about what the ramifications of that are. But there's really no financial benefit. There's no regulatory restriction. There's really nothing imposed upon a nation when a site is listed on the World Heritage List. The poorer nations do have the ability to request funds from the World Heritage Fund to help with their conservation efforts. But other than that, there's no real financial benefit to this. So let's look at the United States. We're about 3.8 million square miles, a population of about 327 million, and we have 24 World Heritage Sites. And we've already looked at the list, and we see what some of these things are. The Statue of Liberty, this is University of Virginia, the Guggenheim, Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, the cliff dwellings. So we see, that gives you some sense of just a taste of some of these sites in the United States. Cuba, which is comparatively small compared to the United States, has 9 World Heritage Sites, which is a lot for a place of this size, quite frankly. You can see most of them are cultural sites. There are 2 natural resource sites here. They're down more on sort of the eastern end of the island. This is the disembarkation of the Granma, and then this is the Humboldt National Park. So Cuba, it has a land mass of just over 42,000 square miles. Again, it's about half the size of the United Kingdom from a land mass perspective. The population is a little over 11 million. The population of Georgia is a little over 10 million, so not much bigger than we are in terms of population. But 9 World Heritage Sites, which you can see here represented in these photographs. So I want to talk about a few of these World Heritage sites. We're going to look at 3 or 4 of them here in a little more detail, and then I want to go into a little bit more detail even about one of these sites. But the first site in Cuba that was inscribed in the World Heritage list is Old Havana and its fortification system. Now this site had been declared a national landmark by the Cuban government in 1978. And you see here this map from 1882 that shows you this area right here that was essentially Old Havana. This is the original Spanish city here. And then the fortifications are here and here and here and here. So this is a city that's founded in 1519 by the Spanish. Much of the original street pattern was still here by the 20th century. These urban plazas that had really been the centers of activity during the Spanish colonial period was still there, and this network of defensive installations, the stone fortifications, were still there. So it's generally thought that Old Havana had retained its integrity probably better than any of these other colonial cities in the Caribbean. So this shows you the map from the UNESCO site with the areas that are in orange, part of the World Heritage property. So you see here, this is another fortification here. And this area that's in green is what the World Heritage Convention calls the buffer zone. And it's an area that it's encouraged to try to preserve as much of that area as you can that's surrounding some of these resources. Now, the original city wall of the Spanish city actually ran right along here. And when that wall was torn down in the 19th century, and the city, if I can get my pointer back, this stretch was being developed, and the national capital was constructed right here. That area was actually folded in as part of the Old Havana World Heritage List property as well, even though it does not date back quite as old as the rest of this. So you get a better sense of it here. This was the area that was the original old city wall. So what do we have here? We have things that date to the Spanish colonial period, which of course goes up to 1898. But we also have some buildings that date after that. For instance, the Capitol that you see here, which is it's not entirely made of Stone Mountain granite, but there is a lot of Stone Mountain granite in that building. Or the Presidential Palace that you see right here, which is now it's now a museum called the Museum of the Revolution. But you also have things like this, these historic squares that have been restored. You have things like these fortresses and the lighthouse there. That dates to the 18th century. So a real mix of things that really tell the entire architectural history of this area. And one of the reasons that Havana was fairly well preserved was because there was not a lot of development pressure in Havana, especially after 1959. Why might that be? Castro. So the revolution rolls into town, rolls into Havana on January 1st, 1959. And under the Castro regime, the emphasis was on developing the rural areas in Cuba and sort of decentralizing things, encouraging people to move out of Havana. Castro felt that Havana was overcrowded and overdeveloped, and he was really not interested in trying to do very much with Havana, so it was sort of left alone. And there was not a lot of new construction and new development that went on there. So that actually helped, in some ways, save Old Havana, but we'll talk about in just a little bit how it sort of leads to the demise of a number of buildings in Old Havana as well. Now, another site that's on the western end of the island, which you can see right here, is Viñales Valley, and this is inscribed as a cultural resource, which I found in some ways sort of surprising. It seems like it could be a mixed resource. It's as famous actually for the landscape in this area as it is for the cultural aspects of this area. It's this valley here that is surrounded by what we call mogotes, these limestone mountains that are covered with vegetation. And then you have this very sort of flat valley in here. But within this area, they use traditional techniques for agriculture. It's predominantly tobacco production, and there is a great deal of vernacular architecture, mostly associated with the tobacco production. So you can see here, nobody's out here plowing with tractors. They're out here plowing with oxen. It's simultaneously sort of massive scale of agriculture, but also tiny scale agriculture. So there's a lot of it, but it's usually done on smaller farms. And you get some sense here of what I was talking about in terms of this landscape. It's really breathtaking. You actually have to come up over the mountains to get into this valley, and it's really a stunning sight when you come into the valley, when you come crest the mountain. Down sort of in the middle of the valley is the city of Trinidad, and the Valley of the Sugar Mills. So this was really the heart of sugar production in Cuba. The city of Trinidad, you see right here, becomes one of the wealthiest cities in Cuba in the 18th and 19th centuries because of the sugar mills that are in the valley surrounding it. Trinidad has a really interesting blend of architecture, sort of this Spanish and Moorish influences, and then a little bit later some neoclassical style buildings, and then the valley surrounding it contain remnants of 75 former sugarcane mills. Some of them are now archaeological sites, some of them are historic sites, and you can visit some of these former sugarcane plantations. So you get some sense here. This is a sugarcane plantation that's out in this valley area. This top row of photographs are from the city of Trinidad. It's a small city, very compact, but very much still has its original street patterns and many of its original buildings that go back 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century. So one of the natural resource parks is the disembarkation of the Granma National Park. It is listed on the World Heritage list because of the ecological diversity of this area. You can see where it is here, right here on this little point, sort of on the southeastern end of the island, and you get some sense here. Ecologically, it's very diverse. There are limestone caverns here, waterfalls, sort of stair steps off the side of the cliffs. There's also a beautiful beach area here, and this was a national park before it was listed as a World Heritage Site. And the name of this national park, Disembarkation of the Granma, refers to the landing of Fidel Castro and his 80 comrades on the yacht, the Granma, in 1956. This is where they came ashore when they sailed in from Mexico to begin the revolution. So that's where the name comes from. But this is not listed as a cultural site. It is listed as a natural resource site. So you get some sense of the natural resource component here. But also in the middle of this, because it's also a national park, there's this monument to the landing of the Granma and to the men who were killed as they came ashore here at this particular location. So I've sort of hinted a little bit at this, but what do you think the impact of World Heritage status might be on a site, especially in a lesser developed country? Yeah.
Probably like the economic result of it in terms of people coming and spending money.
Yeah, so some economic benefit with people coming and spending money. Did I see another hand? Yeah, Faraday. Right, ecological or architectural preservation, certainly that's the hope, right? What else? Anything else? Yeah. International cooperation and friendship, again, that's the dream, right? That's the hope. So certainly this listing draws attention to neglected treasures or treasures that maybe are not necessarily neglected but that are not as well known as they deserve to be, and places of historic interest or national beauty. Heightened awareness may lead to tourism and economic development, as we mentioned. It can help save places from destruction by human forces by raising awareness of its importance and significance. And for poorer countries, it can result in extra funds to help with this conservation effort through the World Heritage Fund. What about the negative side? Political corruption. It can be overwhelmed by tourists, right? So this same thing that's actually a benefit can actually, it's sort of a double-edged sword. It can be a negative as well. What else? Yep.
The site may see like more waste and stuff. People abandon.
So, what?
They might see more waste in terms of the at the site, more waste like trash.
More waste and trash, certainly. You absolutely get that. Yeah, did I see a hand in the back? Yes, I think I can't really hear because we've got the wind tunnel thing going up here, but you said something about local residents.
Like resenting the fact that such monies are being spent to be helping poor communities.
When they don't have running water, for instance, or whatnot. Yeah, all of those things are true. You can get intense tourism development, and those tourists can destroy your resources. There are documented cases of this happening. You get sort of the development of idealized traditions where the traditions and culture of a local place become sort of idealized and then sanitized. And we start to see things like chain restaurants coming in or chain stores coming into some of these places where they had never been before to serve these hordes of tourists, right? The impact on the local population. The local population may question why money is being spent on certain things, but we also have this problem of gentrification oftentimes, where the local population that has maybe inhabited an area for a very long time actually gets pushed out of that area in favor of wealthier people, in favor of tourists and whatnot. And we also sometimes run into that problem of having a place get frozen in time. So it's no longer sort of naturally evolving. This is true with cultural sites for sure, where the sort of the natural trajectory of how things would have evolved in terms of the way people live and practice their their traditions and their culture become sort of stifled and frozen in time because of the pressures, again, emanating from tourism and trying to present this idealized tourism. And this has led to a term called UNESCO-cide, where historically getting on the World Heritage List was thought to be a great thing. It meant you had a really important resource. It was of outstanding universal value, and the rest of the world was going to recognize that. And now people are starting to rethink this, whether it's actually worth being on this list. And there are two sites here. There are many other sites where this applies, but two sites that I wanted to make you aware of. One is the town of Luang Prabang in Laos, and it is a site that has a number of monasteries. It has this sort of traditional architecture like you see here with the Buddhist temples and these sort of local Laos urban structures, and also a layer of French colonial structures, and much of that has been preserved. And up until fairly recently, probably the last 20 years or so, it was not a place where a lot of tourists would come to visit. It's kind of hard to get to. It gets on the World Heritage List, and it becomes a hugely popular tourist destination. It's a town of about 50,000 people. And you can see in 2018, they had 700,000 tourists. So you can imagine what that volume of tourism does to a fairly small city that's in a remote area. I mean, they've just been overwhelmed. Yes?
So, how would you define UNESCO-cide? I think you had to create a definition for it.
That it gets listed on the World Heritage Site, and then what happens is all of those negative things that we just talked about on that previous slide, that the volume of tourists becomes so great that it's beyond the capacity of the place to manage it, that it starts to stifle these local cultural traditions, that essentially it becomes a negative thing, and it sort of strangles the place in a way. In the historic district of Panama, and this is in some ways similar location to the Old Havana. So we have, again, a place that's founded in 1519. That's now the archaeological component of this. And then the settlement moves in the mid-17th century to this new town that's now the historic district that dates back to the 17th century. It has its original street plan, a lot of its original architecture, and this mixture of Spanish and French and early American styles. But what has happened in this historic district is gentrification, because whereas this area was historically inhabited by a real mix of people, but a fairly high concentration of poor people, those people have been basically removed from this historic district. The buildings have been rehabbed, and now the majority of them are actually owned by wealthy foreigners who don't even live there full time. So they come and they stay and come and go, but it sort of creates this really pretty ghost town almost. Yeah. Sort of, yes. It can be. So let's look again at Old Havana. Because Old Havana, it has some similarities to the historic district of Panama, but Old Havana is often held up as being a great success story as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So the size of Old Havana, it's less than 1 square mile, it's 0.82 square miles, a little bit over 66,000 residents. And to give you some sense, the entire metropolitan area of Havana, which is a huge, what they call the Department of Havana, is about 2 million people. And so 66,000, a little over 66,000, actually closer to 67,000, live in this historic district that we call Old Havana. There are 3,370 buildings within this district that's listed on the World Heritage List, and 551 of those 3,370 buildings are considered to be of high heritage value. That is, they are old enough and have maintained enough of their architectural integrity that they are considered being worthy of preservation at the highest level. As I mentioned earlier, it's declared a national monument in 1978 and then inscribed in 1982 as a World Heritage Site as an outstanding example of an architectural ensemble which illustrates a significant stage in history, and as an outstanding example of a traditional human settlement which is representative of a culture and which has become vulnerable under the impact of irreversible change. So Cuba certainly falls into that category of being a developing nation that was eligible for financial support from the World Heritage Fund. And between 1985 and 2002, they've put in 7 requests for a total of a little over $263,000 for help, which is just a tiny fraction of what they have needed for their heritage preservation and conservation efforts. So 5 of those were for conservation. This was for planned conservation initiatives. And then 2 of those were for emergency assistance. And perhaps the most significant of those happens in 1993 when an event happens that really changes the way that historic preservation works in the city of Old Havana. And at that point, so it was 11 years into this World Heritage listing. There is an entity called the Office of the Historian of the City of Havana, who oversees this national monument, World Heritage Site. This gentleman who you see here, Eusebio Leal Spengler, was appointed as the city historian in 1967. It's said that this was the second most powerful person in Havana, second only to Fidel, when Fidel was alive. And some of this comes about because of this event that happens in 1993. So the Office of the City Historian had put in place some mechanisms to begin restoration of some of these 551 important buildings in Old Havana. He had created this National Center for Conservation, Restoration, and Museum Studies that both focused on the rehabilitation of historic buildings, but also trained craftspeople to do the work. So this was part of this holistic vision that the historian had, that not only were they going to do this work, but they were going to create jobs and train people to do this repair work and this rehabilitation work in the traditional ways. And then in 1993, a British journalist was doing a story in Havana, and he is visiting one of the squares, and he's taking a picture of a building in Plaza Vieja, and the building collapsed in front of him. And he was a journalist for The Independent, and he did a story on that. And it was really embarrassing for Cuba. And this was, what else had happened in the early 90s that had a dramatic impact on Cuba? Yes, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Their GDP went down 35%. Caloric intake for Cuban citizens went down 40%. Think about that. If you cut out 40% of your caloric intake, people were literally starving in Cuba. And then on top of that, this building collapsed. So they have no hard currency. Their trading partner has collapsed. Their economy was in shambles. And then this building collapsed. Leal and Fidel were on a flight together going down to somewhere in South America for a meeting. And they're having a conversation about what to do this was just a couple of weeks after this building had collapsed. And Leal comes up with a plan. And it essentially gave great powers to the office of the historian to create an entity. It becomes known as Havana Tourist Company that would rehab and own these buildings and run them as commercial entities and be able to take the profits from those businesses and plow that money back into rehabilitation of more buildings in this historic district. So 45% of their profits would go back into rehabilitation of other historic resources, and then the balance of it, a percentage of it would go to the national government, and then also some would go to provide social services within this historic district. So this was a really innovative way to get funding to carry out this rehabilitation of this area. And it is, the historian Leal was given great leeway to run this as he saw fit. He becomes a rock star in Cuba. He has a weekly TV show, Walks with the Historian, where he's like walking through the neighborhoods in Old Havana and talking about the history. And you know, he has the ear of Fidel, so he is given great autonomy, great power. He is no longer has to report to the municipal government of Havana. He actually reports to the national government, and is given great leeway to basically run this operation. And one of the first buildings that Havana takes on is this hotel called the Hotel Ambos Mundos. And this hotel had been famous back in the day because Ernest Hemingway lived here. This is allegedly the room he was living in when he wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls. You can see the little plaque here. This was a building that had become very run down. It was in terrible shape. And the Office of the Historian came in and restored this building, opened it up as a hotel, and it was hugely successful and almost immediately started turning a profit. It has a very popular restaurant and bar on the rooftop, and you can go up there and you can sort of see all across the city of Havana. So this is a great start for their program that begins in the early 1990s. So I mentioned some of these squares, and what the historian wanted to do was really, so he goes after a building like Ambos Mundos, which is actually fairly close to one of the historic squares, this square, Plaza de Armas. But he wants to focus on restoring the areas around these squares, because the other thing that they're thinking about is creating sort of a tourism zone. And so they want to focus on these 4 historic squares, restore the areas around the squares, and then the areas that connect the squares. And you can see right here, so you see 3, basically, this is where the cruise ships would come and dock. And you can see this one has been restored. These two have not. You go around the backside, and this is not restored at all, because basically the cruise ships come in this way and they dock right here. So they don't ever see this over here. So the focus was on these 4 squares and trying to connect them and restore the areas around the squares. This is the square where the building collapsed in 1993, and this square had really become a huge mess. An underground parking deck had been installed in the 20th century that raised the level of the square by several feet. All of the buildings were in terrible shape. It really was very run down, and so there was an effort to focus on that square pretty early on. The parking deck was removed and the fountain restored and whatnot. So you can see here this color-coded area. The areas that are in blue are the areas that the historian's office has focused on for their rehab efforts. First and foremost, the yellow areas are lower priority areas that they're kind of moving into. The areas that are in red are areas that, as it says, may have to wait years or decades for restoration to reach them. So you can see here the gray areas are the areas that have been rehabilitated here. Again, kind of creating these really almost pathways through the city with areas that are of high interest to tourists. And then the profits that are turned from running the hotels and restaurants and bars that Havanax operates. And the historian's office also created a touring company called San Cristobal and a number of other business entities. And they were also given permission to sign contracts with foreign investors and bring foreign investors in to help fund some of these hotel rehabilitations. And so this really was a huge benefit to the restoration efforts in Old Havana because of the way it brought in hard currency. Now, one of the things that was always important to the historian was to try to minimize the disruption to the people who lived in Old Havana. But they were not 100% successful in this because the population was so dense in this area. You would have 35 families living in one building that really had space for, maybe 8 families. And so there were people just crammed in these areas. There's really not much infrastructure in terms of water in the city. A water truck drives around at night and pumps water up into tanks on the rooftops of buildings. That's how people get water in the city, in a lot of the city. But the historian did very much try to focus on either finding residential accommodations for people either within the city or better housing outside of the city, but trying to keep Old Havana vibrant, not letting happen what had happened in the historic district of Panama, where the entire sort of inner city becomes cleansed of its residents. And the other thing was that 35% of the profits of the operations of the historian would go back into building schools, recreation facilities, and health care and elder care. And you can see here on this map, the green areas are schools, the blue, so you can see the schools here. The blue are elder care and health care facilities, and then the sports and recreation are these red areas. So if you go back to this map, you can see that a lot of the concentration of those resources is in these areas that were the red areas, that they're sort of low on the list in terms of rehabilitation, wholesale rehabilitation of the buildings in there. But what they've done is they've gone in and they've rehabilitated certain buildings in that area. For instance, there's an old convent that has been rehabilitated into a daycare center and a senior citizen home. So that's how they've tried to keep the population, sort of the residential population, intact as much as they can. So this is Plaza Vieja, which was the plaza where the building collapsed. You can see this building in 2007, what this looked like, and this building in 2015. So this was one of the last buildings on this square to be rehabbed. So a lot of people look at this effort to rehabilitate this square. Tourists love to come here. There are restaurants and shops all along here around the square. But there's also a fence around the fountain. And historically, the residents used the fountain as a place to go and get water, and they can no longer do that because there's a fence around the fountain. This was one of these buildings where there were many, many families living in this. They were basically sort of squatters living in here, who eventually had to be relocated so it could be rehabilitated into this building. And now you can find, I think, on Airbnb, an apartment that you can rent in that building. There's a Benetton shop here. So there's some chain stores that have come in here. And so people are sort of wringing their hands over that you've sanitized this square. Yes, you've made some improvements. Yes, the buildings are no longer going to collapse around you. But it's been sanitized in some ways. So, you know, a lot of people have mixed feelings about the outcome here. And by the way, this building that fell down in '93 was not the last building that collapsed with little warning in Havana. It happens all the time. Every month, buildings collapse in Havana. These are buildings that the Office of the Historian has not gotten to yet. They're only about 30% of the way through with the work that they've done. This chart shows you the distribution of architecture in the city with sort of this eclectic is just kind of this mix of local, almost more vernacular kinds of buildings. This Baroque sort of neoclassical stuff is kind of in an arc here and then around here. Modern, postmodern, kind of concentrated in here. And there's actually a good bit of Art Deco and Art Nouveau architecture in Havana as well. In 2012, and you see the text at the top tells us that in 2012, the Old Cities Preservation Program was recognized by UNESCO as one of 25 examples of best practice in World Heritage Management. So even though they haven't gotten everything right, the innovations that they've come up with in terms of a mechanism to constantly generate new funds for their rehabilitation and restoration activities, and also the attention that the Office of the Historian has given to trying to keep as many local residents in the area as possible gets very high marks. A conservation assessor who was evaluating the Old Havana District in 2006 talked about how the city historian has turned the historical center into a place for living, walking, visiting, investing, and a place in which heritage is preserved, people are respected, jobs are created, income is generated, and squares and buildings are used and reused. It's estimated that the programs of the Office of the Historian have created 13,000 jobs in Old Havana. A good number of the folks who go to the training school and who are the craftspeople who are doing the work actually live in the area of Old Havana. And over the years that the historian's office has been running this program, they've had revenues of over $500 million generated by this program. So it has been very successful by many units of measure. And so you get things like these really great restorations and rehabilitations. This is a great Art Deco building that was actually the Bacardi Rum Headquarters. It belonged to the Bacardi family. They fled after the Revolution, so it's no longer owned by the Bacardi family. These that's the Ambos Mundos right here that you see right there. These are residential buildings. This is the square that we looked at earlier. So a lot of these buildings have been very beautifully restored or rehabilitated. But as I mentioned, they've only been able to get to about 30% of the buildings in the historic district up to this point. So you also have a lot of this as you walk around Old Havana. And I'll tell you, if you look at this building right here, you get some sense of how long that shell of a building has been a shell of a building. It's got scaffolding around it that's actually holding up these exterior walls, and the scaffolding has been there so long that the vines have grown all the way up to the top. So that's been like that, or that was like that for many years. I believe that building, that picture was taken in 2016. I believe that building has since been rehabbed and has now opened as a hotel. I think it was a partnership with either a French or a Dutch corporation. So there are a lot of things that are going right in Old Havana, but there's still some things that need some work in the city. But it's certainly been a very interesting model of how to do this, and it really was the World Heritage listing that put the Office of the Historian in the position to be able to do this, because they want Old Havana. Old Havana is the #1 tourist destination there in that area. And so in order to appeal to the tourists, they've had to do this rehabilitation. And the only way they could fund it, because basically the state was broke, was to come up with this innovative way to do this. So, all right, I'll open it up for questions. Anybody has any questions or comments, thoughts? Everybody mostly just wants to get out of this building because it's like tropical heat. Yes?
We have a question. Can you enter every one of those UNESCO's World Heritage sites? Anyone?
Well, there's some that you might not be able to get to because of government restrictions or whatever, but for the most part. And there's some that have been destroyed, like the giant Buddhas were World Heritage sites that were, blown up by the Taliban. But I think for the most part, you can. I mean, we've talked about how this has created a rush of tourists. There are blogs out there of people who essentially don't do anything but travel around the world visiting World Heritage sites and blog about it, which I guess is maybe not super lucrative, but would be fun, I guess. So, yes?
Is there like a standard for how many sites UNESCO wants to add, like every year in 5 years?
It depends on the nominations that are put forward, and it's a very long and tedious review process. I know the Frank Lloyd Wright nomination has been in the hopper for a long time. I do know, because I know the people who are working on this, that the United States presented at this summer's meeting a nomination for sites associated with the American Civil Rights Movement. And they sort of use the model of the Frank Lloyd Wright nomination to put together their nomination, because they're sites that are, it's like, Central High School in Little Rock and Martin Luther King's birth home on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, and the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. So they're scattered, you know, the Medgar Evers home. They're scattered kind of all across the southeast. So they're not co-located. They're just, but it is a multi-part nomination. So they presented it this summer, and it kind of gets sort of like a first reading, and then the committee will give feedback on that nomination, and then the team will go back and work on it and revise it, and it's a multi-year endeavor to get something listed. And like I said, there really has been a focus on trying to move away from all of these Western European locations. I mean, you know, Germany and France have dozens and dozens of locations listed on the World Heritage List, and try to get more locations in Africa and South America and underrepresented areas.